In March of 2024, a quiet night on the outskirts of Moscow was punctured by hails of automatic gunfire. As families fled the Crocus City Hall theatre, a trail of bodies lay strewn behind them, riddled with bullets. The perpetrators, 4 radical terrorists who meticulously planned an attack that would leave hundreds of casualties in their wake. The response, slow and lumbering, security forces asleep at the wheel. And as people scattered in all directions under a hail of gunfire and flames, only one thing was certain: death had come to the heart of the motherland. And the worst part, it was 100% entirely avoidable. So who was to blame for the worst terror attack in Russia in 2 decades? How was it allowed to happen entirely unchallenged? And how would Moscow try to weaponize the crisis for its own gain? This is the story of a bitter symphony indeed. Right, so to understand where the hell everything went wrong here, we need to highlight some important factors on Russia, terrorism, and international relations that led to this human catastrophe. Crocus City Hall is a venue for large events on the northwestern outskirts of Russia's capital of Moscow. It stands about 20 kilometers or 12 miles from the heart of the motherland's government in a region known as Krasnogorsk. On the 22nd of March, a well-known Russian rock band formed back in the 70s in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, by the name of Picnic, was due to perform there. And if I do say so myself, their members look absolutely fabulous. More than 6,000 Russians, mainly from the surrounding Krasnogorsk and Moscow metropolitan areas, would buy tickets to attend the event to relive a little nostalgia, enjoy some good music, and bask in the style of whatever this is, I guess. But 2 weeks before this concert was set to go ahead, trouble was already brewing. Terror cell networks were going crazy across Central Asia and Russia itself. Something just wasn't right. And warnings would reach the Kremlin from one of the most unlikely of places, Washington, D.C. Now, the Russian bear and Uncle Sam historically have gotten on about as well as an actual Russian bear and my Uncle Sam. That is to say that relations have been pretty frosty for a while now, even if certain individuals within the US government are somewhat more sympathetic these days. So why on earth would the US share intelligence about potential terror attacks with the Kremlin? Well, that's pretty complicated. Governments don't have to like each other or even get on, and they can still share intelligence with one another under what's known as the duty to warn policy. It was a law the US passed in 2015 stating that if the US has credible intel about certain threats in foreign countries, then they must legally warn the country about those threats or otherwise be somewhat complicit in what happens to people in such cases where a place is attacked. And if you think about it, it's actually pretty sensible. One of the United States' global foreign policy goals is to curtail terrorism wherever it may rear its ugly, radicalized head, and so moves like this, with relatively little effort, can build some goodwill between the country's security networks. With the US's global surveillance efforts targeting terror networks, they were likely in the best position to try and give Moscow a little bit of a heads up. You never know when the favor could be returned. When it comes to terrorism, rivals do tend to cooperate internationally because terrorism is a shared enemy of both the White House and the Kremlin, so anyone taking out terrorists is a general benefit to the United States, regardless of who does it. If you are being more cynical, and I absolutely am, it's also important to mention that even in 2024, Americans did still live in Russia. So when the note came out of the US Embassy in Moscow about the chances for an attack, Uncle Sam was looking out for its own citizens primarily first. And it also is a messaging tool of a different kind. If a warning comes and an attack does occur, it shows everyone that the US has credible intelligence and competence when it comes to security. This is a subtle nudge to Russia to watch its actions because it begs the question, what else could Washington know? International relations can be pretty funny sometimes. It's like having Batman and the Joker have to occasionally team up to defeat a greater enemy. They can always go back to their bickering tomorrow. The US warning in particular pertained to large gatherings happening in and around Moscow and specifically mentioned large events like concerts being a target for attacks. The US had also singled out the likely culprits of such an attack should one come. Another shared enemy between US and Russia? ISIS. Remember them? The radical Salafist terror group that were beheading people on the internet? Well, As it turns out, despite being absolutely obliterated from their peak back in the mid-2010s, ISIS had since spread to other regions of the world outside of their primary territory of operation in Iraq and Syria. Whether it's radicals who already shared similar ideals pledging allegiance to ISIS independently, or a targeted spread by the main body of the organization itself, what's left of it anyway, ISIS has evolved and spread. It now operates like other terror networks, focusing on isolated cells and radicalizing people to its cause from afar. ISIS's messaging didn't have to travel far to resonate with individuals in Central Asia, and voila, ISIS-K, or Islamic State Khorasan province, was born. Khorasan is a region of Central Asia that comprises parts of Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, as well as a little bit of Kazakhstan and Pakistan as well. It's apparently an all-stand party and everybody's invited. ISIS-K is a terror network that seeks to establish a caliphate, think of it like a radical Islamic empire, in this region. But why am I telling you all of this? What does this even have to do with Russia? Well, as it turns out, ISIS-K really has a bee in their collective bonnet when it comes to Russia. According to Colin Clark, a counterterrorism analyst based in New York who did an interview with the New York Times in 2024, ISIS-K had been fixated on Russia for the last 2 years. ISIS-K directly accused the Russian government of having Muslim blood on their hands. In particular, this is in reference to Russia's support of Bashar al-Assad's Syrian government, which has since fallen. The Russians helped ruthlessly bomb Syria flat when targeting both ISIS and Western-backed factions fighting in opposition to the al-Assad regime. Russia has been responsible for a lot of bloodshed in the Middle East over the decades, much like the United States has. ISIS-K were mad about that. They were also upset how Moscow treated Afghanistan during the Soviet era, as well as its semi-autonomous region of Chechnya, especially in its war against the region in the early 2000s. And from the tip of Western Turkmenistan, it's only a roughly 500-kilometer hop, skip, and a jump over the Caspian Sea to get into Chechnya itself and the Russian mainland. ISIS-K have been responsible for plenty of terror attacks since it was established, killing several US soldiers and civilians in Kabul airport in 2021, and they've also claimed responsibility for many deadly bombings in Iraq. What this means is that they have steadily gained the means, motive, and proximity to target Russia as the organization grew in capability and sophistication. It was arguably only a matter of time before a threat like the one the US passed on came about. But the Kremlin was suspicious and complained that the US intelligence lacked specific detail. And it seemed they didn't take the US's message about the threat from ISIS-K seriously enough. Instead, Russian President and all-round party pooper Vladimir Putin chose to see the warning as a threat, but not from ISIS or radical Islam, but from the West. In March of 2024, Russia at this point had crossed the second anniversary of its invasion of Ukraine. It was no secret that the war was deeply unpopular with Putin's ideological enemies in the West, to the point of arming and supporting Ukraine. In the wake of these warnings from Uncle Sam, Putin accused the West and Ukraine of trying to sow dissent and fear within the Russian population. Let's quote Big Bad Vlad himself, shall we? He stated, quote, "Recent provocative statements by a number of official Western structures about the possibility of terrorist attacks in Russia resembles outright blackmail and an intention to intimidate and destabilize our society." 3 days before the concert was to take place in Crocus Hall, Putin addressed the board of Russia's Federal Security Service, also known as the FSB. Think of them a little bit like Russia's modern FBI that grew out of the former KGB, whose role is to defend the country from threats. In that meeting, Putin asserted to the assembled leaders of the security service that Russia's very special military operation was the top priority, claiming that Ukraine had resorted to so-called terrorist tactics. In reality, it's more likely that Putin was looking to connect such threats to Ukraine in just about any way he could justify for escalating the conflict and painting Ukraine in a bad light. But hold that thought, we're definitely going to come back to it. So, it seems that Russia wouldn't heed Uncle Sam's warning, even though the US would later state that the intelligence it shared with Russia had been, quote, "specific, timely, and credible," end quote. Hell, even Iran reportedly had also warned Moscow of a possible attack on Russian soil, though we could not confirm this because Iran is less than forthcoming with this kind of information for obvious reasons. As part of the Khorasan region, and a general ally of the Kremlin, Iran has no reason to lie about a potential attack, and it stands to reason that if Tehran and Washington DC agree on anything, you should probably listen to what that anything is. But Putin made his choice, a choice that would turn out to be absolutely devastating. On the evening of March the 22nd, the Russian general public flocked towards Crocus City Hall, eager to hear the rock and roll tunes of Picnic firsthand. Friends shared laughs and drinks, older generations reveled in the nostalgia of yesteryear, and children excitedly gripped onto their parents' sleeves as they wandered through the cold Russian night towards the building. Sadly, many would never leave. It was around 8 p.m., as the show was soon to begin, that 4 armed gunmen calmly got out of a car nearby and walked toward the entrance of the hall. They were decked out in camouflage and tactical equipment, and as they slowly walked towards the entrance amongst civilians, they began to open fire indiscriminately. No full and comprehensive list of the weapons the 4 attackers used currently exists that we could find, but according to a mix of both international and domestic Russian sources, they appear to have been armed to the teeth. Amongst their arsenal were AK-style assault rifles, as well as pistols, knives, and even some kind of incendiary devices. Some sources list these as petrol bombs, others as Molotov cocktails. Russia's investigative committee would simply refer to it as a flammable liquid. Washington, D.C.'s warning was right, and for Russia, things were about to go oh so wrong. Due to the volume of people in and around Crocus City Hall at the time, there are scores of witnesses as well as video evidence that brave souls captured on their phone whilst the attack unfolded. The 4 men were absolutely ruthless. Footage, which we cannot show on this channel, and we wouldn't particularly want to even if we could, shows the men gunning down innocent, defenseless people right outside the entrance, firing into groups who were trying to huddle together and shield themselves, but to no avail. They killed and wounded a substantial number of the general public just on their way across the concourse toward the entrance. Unarmed security guards outside the entrance were powerless to do anything against the terrorists who were armed for warfare. All 4 men then convened at the front entrance before walking through the unguarded metal detectors and entering the hall. As they went, they targeted anyone in their way, finishing off the wounded and the vulnerable. In the auditorium, there was unease and confusion. Was this part of the show? Was it fireworks that had gone off somewhere by accident? Confusion, however, quickly turned to horror and panic as the 4 men burst into the main auditorium and started firing on spectators. A woman later told Russian TV that she and other visitors inside the auditorium rushed towards the stage as soon as they realized shots were being fired, quoting her, "I saw a person in the stalls with a sidearm, and there were cracks of gunfire going off. I was trying to crawl behind a loudspeaker." And of course, total chaos ensued. Some people fled in every direction, desperately trying to find a way out of the building higher up, only to find certain doors that they tried were locked. Others hid in the aisles between their seats, ducking for cover as gunfire went off all around them, with many caught in the crossfire. Images and videos of the attack in the auditorium itself show people huddled together and staying low as bullets whizzed by. The attackers were urging each other to, quote, "show no mercy, kill them all." Soon, one or several of the attackers used whatever incendiary devices they had brought with them to start a fire, hoping that the blaze would engulf the building and trap as many people inside as possible. This, of course, only further contributed to the ongoing panic. Elderly people tried to move quickly into safe areas. Parents dived for their children to shield them from the gunfire. All the while, people were being crushed in the stampede to try and escape Crocus City Hall. The atmosphere was a mix of pure horror and confusion. Other videos show people finding exits to leave the building en masse, walking past bullet-riddled bodies strewn about the grounds of the theater. Even in these moments where the dead and dying lay around them, people were still trying to understand what had just happened in their heads, thinking out loud about fireworks and other less deadly explanations. Their minds may have been so traumatized that their brains were desperately trying to latch onto any plausible chance that they had not just been the victims of a terror attack. But the evidence around them defied what many told themselves as they fled into the cold Russian evening, some without any winter gear, or having lost their coats in the chaos. The flames would soon totally engulf the facade of the building, while glass on the top 2 floors of the 7-story building blew out. Firefighters were unable to get close to the building to put out the fire straight away because the attackers were still present. It would eventually take them 10 hours to fully contain the blaze. Many people died of various bullet wounds and even reportedly some stabbing and slashing wounds. Others succumbed to smoke inhalation as the fire ripped through the roof of the building. People were left injured, traumatized, and sometimes permanently disabled from it all. According to one Telegram channel reported on by The Guardian, there were 28 bodies all found huddled together in a single bathroom. Another 14 were discovered later in an emergency stairwell. Clearly, they'd been trying to hide from the gunmen, only to either be found and cornered, or they'd been trapped by the blaze in their final moments. Picnic's band members would later release a statement on Instagram that they were all safe and alive, but some reports do mention someone associated with the band being missing after the attack, who was later presumed to have been killed. And all of this happened in 20 minutes. And it only stopped because the suspects themselves fled the scene in a white Renault, which they'd arrived in. During this time, well over 100 people had been killed, and in the end, the death toll would reach 145, with over 600 injured, making it the deadliest Russian terror attack in 2 decades. So the question needed to be asked, where were the police in all of this? How were 4 terrorists allowed to shoot up and burn down Crocus City Hall with impunity, hunting people down and roaming the theater freely for 20 whole minutes? Well, it comes down to a few factors. As Krasnogorsk is in the Moscow Oblast, its rapid response force comes from the heart of the city. There was no immediate tactical police presence in Krasnogorsk, only a small community police force that could not have contained the attack. On a Friday evening, during gridlock traffic, there were delays to get armed forces to the hall as quickly as possible. And the general timing and speed of the attack implied knowledge of such practical limitations, showing how it was a coordinated and well-planned affair. The mass shooting, combined with starting a fire, quickly made the situation completely unmanageable for anyone but the state security apparatus. The Russian authorities have also been criticized in their slow response. The first calls of the attack came in soon after it had begun, but alert systems and the people running them did not recognize the true scale of the attack and thought at first it was more of an isolated shooting or arson incident. By the time the authorities had a full grasp on what was happening, the building was already totally ablaze and the situation was well and truly out of control. Similarly, as sometimes happens in these scenarios, different security forces bickered over who had jurisdiction to lead the response, with the confusion further delaying substantial help from arriving. According to the French publication Le Monde, the special forces dispatched to alleviate the tragedy took more than an hour to arrive from the first shots being fired. Some sources put the general police response at more like 30 to 40 minutes, but even that was too slow, and the attackers were already gone long before the police got there. It would take another 5 hours for them to eventually track down the Renault heading on the M3 highway towards the Russia-Ukraine border. There's some contention about what this meant for the attackers' motivations, but we'll talk about that shortly. They were eventually intercepted by Russian security forces near the village of Katsun at almost 4 in the morning. It said that 2 were detained who were still in the car, and 2 others were captured after a short local search on foot. According to Russian sources, so feel free to take that with a dump truckload of salt, several weapons, ammunition, and Tajik passports were found in the car. 160 tons of water would need to be dropped on Crocus City Hall by helicopters alongside the 10-hour firefight on the ground before the inferno was finally contained. All that was left was the burned-out husk of the building, magazine cartridges, and a trail of blood. It was finally over. So what would become of this tragedy? How would the Russian state respond to its most brazen and deadly terror attack in 2 decades? Once the dust had settled, it was time for everyone to take stock of what had just occurred and to process their trauma and grief for those who had lost their lives. The attack was the single deadliest in Russia since the early 2000s. The attack bore a striking resemblance to the 2002 Dubrovka theater attack, in which 170 people died after hundreds were taken hostage inside by radical Islamic militants, although on that occasion they were Chechen. The attack on the Crocus Theater also was the first successful ISIS terror attack to take place on Russian soil. ISIS-K were quick to take credit for the attack via their media and propaganda arm Amak, releasing a photo of what it said were the 4 attackers who had ended so many innocent lives on the outskirts of Moscow. Of course, their faces are blurred, but the context clues of the clothes they were wearing in the picture alongside Amak's own footage of the attack, as well as social media cross-referencing, led to the confirmed identification of the 4 attackers who took part in the massacre. They also released a video alongside this image of the attack itself from the radicals' perspective, but due to the shocking crimes committed during it, we're not going to show it to you on YouTube. Just know it is out there, and it's very graphic. We personally advise against trying to find it online, but if your morbid curiosity does get the better of you, don't say we didn't warn you. The video shows one of the men with an AK-style rifle mowing people down as he fires it fully automatic into people's bodies. Another man with a knife viciously slashed at a dying civilian's chest and throat. The BBC has since verified this footage as genuine and could confirm that it was released by ISIS. Some 14 hours after the first reports of shots being fired at Crocus City Hall, the FSB announced that it had arrested 11 people in relation to the attack. According to Al Jazeera, this number would eventually rise to over 20 people who were connected to the massacre, showcasing the coordination that went into such a deadly operation. 6 more people would eventually be tried in absentia for their various connections to the attack, including the recruitment of the men. On Sunday, the 24th of March, the 4 men would be dragged into a Moscow courtroom and were named publicly for the first time. Just to warn you, these are Tajik names, meaning that they're extremely hard to pronounce. I'm not Tajik, nor do I speak Tajik, so we're doing our best here. They were Darlazon Mirzoyev, Saida Krami, Muradali, Rachabalizodar, Shatisin Faridoni, and Muhammad Sabir Fazov. All 4 were originally from Tajikistan, but living in Russia as part of the vast Central Asian diaspora that exists in the country. All 4 were charged with terrorism-related offenses. And when we say that they were dragged into the courtroom, we are not kidding. When all 4 men were brought into the courtroom, they were battered and bruised beyond belief, with swollen faces, massive bandages, and a lot of injuries that they hadn't appeared to have sustained during the attack. The Russian media made no attempt to hide that they'd been savagely beaten and tortured. In fact, videos of the interrogations of the suspects where they were ruthlessly beaten were later circulated on social media. It's kind of hard to feel any sympathy for these men who caused so much wanton suffering in the name of their twisted dogma, and it appeared that the Russian authorities didn't either. In court, 3 of the men showcased their heavy bruising and extensively swollen faces to the extent that it was actually quite hard to recognize them when all battered and bloodied. The youngest of the men, Faizov, who was just 19 at the time, was wheeled into the courtroom in a wheelchair and wearing a hospital gown. He appeared, at best, semi-conscious, whilst he and his conspirators sat in a glass box inside the courtroom for their pre-trial detention sentencing. Faizov also reportedly had a urine drainage bag. Law enforcement officers had apparently dislodged his eye during his arrest, necessitating surgery. In a video of Rachabalizod's arrest, officers are seen threatening to shoot him in the legs, unleash a dog on him, and cut off his head. Another video shows a man in camouflage cutting off a part of the man's ear and forcing it into his mouth whilst telling him to eat it. He also threatened to cut off and feed the terrorist his own genitals. Russian media stated that the man had cut his own ear off during interrogation, but the video, which again we can't show you owing to its extremely graphic content, proves this to be demonstrably false. The knife in question would creatively be referred to as the ear cutter, and was later sold at auction. The video also shows soldiers beating him with the butts of rifles. A photograph would later be circulated showing Fariduni on the ground with his hands bound and his trousers pulled down. Whilst the image is blurred, it's not hard to see there are wires connected to a battery which are clearly administering shocks to his genitals. The photo was published by a Telegram channel connected to the Wagner Group and suggested that Fariduri had been shocked repeatedly and that water had been poured over him to intensify the effect of the torture. Meanwhile, Mirzoyev arrived with hefty facial bruises after his interrogation, with the remnants of a plastic bag still wrapped around his neck. It's believed that part of his interrogation therefore included him being asphyxiated with said plastic bag. This is a common torture technique in Russia, according to Human Rights Watch, and the message was real clear. You go low, we go lower. Clearly, the very public nature of the men appearing in such a rough condition was a feature, not a bug. It was about sending an important idea to anyone who would even think about doing something as heinous as these guys in the future. And this has created something of a debate about the role of the kind of punishment in Russia's legal system. Let's be clear here from the get-go. There is no question about these men's guilt, given the mountain of evidence against them. These men carried out one of the worst massacres in modern Russian history. The horror they caused is beyond words. The trauma they left behind for innocent people is unspeakable, and no punishment will ever balance out what they collectively had done. But what followed, with this very public example of beating and torture, which the Russian regime has largely celebrated, shows just how quickly Russia's idea of law and order can blur into political theatre, and it displays the ease with which vengeance replaces justice. The victims deserved accountability. Instead, Russia offered a spectacle. Did they deserve it? Well, we'll let you make up your own mind on that one. But even if they most likely did, their physical states in that courtroom, bloody and swollen on display for the world to see, tells us a lot about how the Kremlin chooses to operate when it wants to send a message. But, as we mentioned prior, it wouldn't just be those 4 who would stand trial for this horrific crime. 3 other natives of Tajikistan, all members of the same family, were arrested for allegedly providing the attackers with accommodation, transportation, and communication. It also came out in the aftermath of the attack that the weapons they used to carry it out may have come from Dagestan, another heavily Islamic region of Russia located close to Chechnya. The men's trial began in early August of 2025. In total, 19 people would be put on trial by the Russian state for their hand in the attack. As of late 2025, when this video is being recorded, no public verdict or sentencing for anyone involved in the massacre has been confirmed in international or domestic Russian sources. However, knowing Russia and knowing how terrorists are commonly sentenced, the 4 main perpetrators of the attack are likely to get life in prison and to be sent to some of the worst, most notorious and high-security prisons in Russia. They will spend up to 23 hours per day in their cells for the rest of their lives. Any of the other accomplices may well get less prison time, but they will likely face the same harsh conditions. In Russia, prison is purely punitive in nature. It's there to punish criminals. And boy, are these 4 going to be punished. This case has actually sparked something of a debate in Russian society over their current moratorium on the death penalty that came into effect in 1996. Several high-profile Russian politicians came out after the attack in favor of putting the 4 men who attacked Crocus City Hall to death, the most important of them being former Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who stated, quote, "Should they be killed? They should be, and will be. But it's much more important to kill everyone involved. Everyone. Those who paid, who sympathized with them, who helped them, kill them all." Those last 3 words were the same as what the jihadists themselves were stating during the attack. But there would be something of a twist in this tale still, because remember when I said near the beginning of the video today that Putin and co. were desperate to find a way to blame Ukraine and the West for the attack? Well, the Russian government chose to double down. It's important to understand that the attack on Crocus City Hall by ISIS-K, whilst undoubtedly tragic for Russians everywhere, the whole affair was deeply embarrassing for Putin as well as for the Russian government. For starters, the attack came days after President Putin had started his record 5th term in office. That likely was not a coincidence and was significant for Putin for several reasons. The war of aggression that Russia had been waging in Ukraine was killing thousands of Russians every week. Putin had staked his claim on bringing former glory back to the motherland, but had become bogged down for over 2 years by that point. Putin needed to appear strong to marshal the war and keep the general public behind him. A terror attack 20 kilometers away from his own capital and seat of power challenges that notion. On top of that, the government was made to look amateurish in its response, reacting slowly to the attack due to the great big lumbering security bureaucracy in the country. A bureaucracy that was proving it couldn't keep its citizens safe. And on top of all that, the government failed to heed the warnings it got from the United States, which made Washington look switched on and confident and made Moscow look like they were stumbling around in the dark by comparison. I mean, this was an ISIS terror attack. I don't know how much you know about ISIS, but you probably know that most of their attacks don't usually end with their terrorist soldiers getting away. So instead of owning up to the mistake that got 145 people killed and hundreds more injured through nothing other than a government's own incompetence, the Kremlin puffed out its chest and blamed the whole thing on Ukraine whilst showing its strength by beating up the terrorists once they'd caught them. It's hard to know if it was always the plan to blame the attack on Ukraine, if it was a moment of opportunism, but Moscow justified it all the same. So why do it? Well, there are several theories. The first is that perhaps Russia assumed the threats were empty or that the US had overstated their likelihood. So when the government brushed them off and turned out to be cataclysmically wrong, blaming Ukraine would have been seen as a way to divert blame away from Russian security officials who had made mistakes. Russia then used the embassy intel from Uncle Sam and its prior warning of an imminent attack as proof that the West was somehow involved in the whole thing. Another more conspiratorial theory is that Russia even let the Crocus City Hall attack go ahead in order to place the blame for it on Ukraine. If Russia could convince the world that Ukraine was supporting terrorism against innocent people, perhaps countries would be less likely to give them support in the ongoing war. Russia has been known to stage false flag attacks in the past as justification for military escalation, but this is unlikely given the sheer scope of the massacre. Either way, blaming Ukraine may well attempt to take some of the blame away from the Russian government, but it also partially absolves the terrorists themselves who committed such a barbaric act. Russia put forward what it considered evidence for Ukraine's involvement. Firstly, the fact that the attackers fled towards Ukraine allowed the Kremlin to point the finger squarely at Kyiv. Putin stated in the aftermath of the attack that, quote, "Based on preliminary information, a window for crossing the border was prepared for them by the Ukrainian side." And for what it's worth, during their interrogation, one of the attackers said it was their intention to go toward Kiev, although that's a bit shakier given the whole torture and vicious beating thing. People will say anything to get the pain to stop. It's very possible that such a confession had been coerced through torture. But to give Putin the tiniest amount of credit, it's true that the attackers fled on the M3 highway out of Moscow broadly towards the Ukrainian border. What is also true is that the attackers attempted to flee towards Belarus first. Belarus's own president, Lukashenko, confirmed as such before stating that the security forces of Belarus had locked down the border, which drove the attackers away, and only then did they move towards Ukraine. Lukashenko, in stating this, confirmed that he was helping Russia with the operation, while simultaneously asserting that Belarus's border wasn't breached by terrorists, which would be a bad look. But what it does do is cast doubt over the attackers seeking to flee towards Ukraine, and goes directly against what Putin said, making his accusation rather fishy. It's also likely that the attackers, despite their organized and coordinated approach for the attack itself, didn't actually have a plan for escape. This is ISIS. Remember, their attacks tend to end in martyrdom, because for them, that is what they believe will bring them the most glory in the afterlife. So we see it like this. The attackers, not expecting to have completed their attack without any police presence whatsoever, tried to escape away from Moscow. Given Krasnogorsk is northeast of the capital itself, the attackers were forced east in order to not go back to Moscow. Highways represent the fastest tickets out of anywhere by car, and the three going east out of Moscow all head towards either Belarus, Ukraine, or both. So, in not expecting to be fleeing the scene of the crime, the terrorists panicked and just took what they thought was the route to get them the maximum distance from the site of the attack as quickly as possible. Given how they were turned around before they hit Belarus, at least according to Lukashenko, would indicate that they really didn't have a formal plan after the attack. The runner they used to flee was registered to one of the men, and it's reported that the attackers split up briefly before rejoining each other once they'd gotten a bit of distance from Moscow. It doesn't exactly scream an elaborate plot to gun it for the Ukrainian border, and even if it was, what then? Enter an active war zone in Russian-occupied territory like Donetsk and Luhansk? What a brilliant strategy that would be. It's not like Belarus was a safer bet either, as being caught there would see them taking a one-way ticket back to Moscow. The reality is that they likely expected to die in Crocus City Hall, and when they didn't, they realized they had half a chance to live, but in fleeing, they had no good options. Russia would continue to double down on this narrative, however. If the Ukrainians weren't directly trying to provide safe passage for the attackers, the Kremlin claimed that the attack had been financed by funds flowing through a Ukraine-based oil and gas firm. Okay, perhaps that is plausible, except the company was dissolved in 2023. It doesn't make it impossible for Ukraine to have still funded the attack this way in theory, but in practice, because it was dissolved, it would have left no trail for Russia to follow to make such accusations. Alexander Bortnikov, head of the FSB security service, told Russian TV after the attack that, quote, "We believe that the action was prepared by both the Islamist radicals themselves and was facilitated by Western special services. The special services of Ukraine are directly related to this." End quote. Next, the Kremlin tried to blame Western media's response for the attack. One official stated that, quote, "There is a strict order not to report in the media the true scale of the tragedy, not to mention the number of victims of the terrorist attack, the dead children. Demonstrations of humanity and sympathy for the Russian people are not allowed." End quote. This, however, is patently untrue. Western media did report the scale of the tragedy at the time of the attack, with reports of well over 100 deaths and hundreds of casualties the very night of the killings. And this doesn't really make sense with the West, the US government, being the ones to warn Russia about an attack in the first place. Russia's only other option was to claim that fundamental Islamic attacks simply didn't happen in Russia, and therefore it must have been done with the influence of Ukraine. Putin himself claimed that, quoting here, "Russia cannot be the target of terrorist attacks by Islamic fundamentalists. We are a country that demonstrates a unique example of interfaith harmony and interreligious and interethnic unity." And again, this is definitely false. Putin is right that Russia is a vast country full of different religions and cultures, but to claim that makes it immune from radical Islamic terrorism is just wrong. Putin himself knows this is a lie, of course. He ordered the war against Chechnya when he first became president in 2000, owing to bombings by radical Islamic Chechens that struck Moscow. Not to mention both the Dubrovka theater attack of 2004 and the 2002 Beslan school siege, which were both instances of attacks perpetrated against Russia by radical Islamic terrorists. I mean, what else can you call a black widow in a full burqa wearing a suicide vest? seems pretty fundamentalist to me. What makes this argument look silliest is that the FSB itself publicly boasted about thwarting an Islamic State attack against a synagogue in Russia the month prior to the Crocus City Hall massacre. Of course, Ukraine fiercely pushed back on any and all accusations, stating that the Russian claims were absolutely untenable and absurd. Ukrainian military intelligence spokesman Andriy Yusov actually went one step further and suggested the attack was a deliberate act of provocation by Putin's special services. However, it's important to note that there was no evidence to go alongside this claim. Experts such as Vladimir Pastukhov, an honorary senior research associate at University College London, would go on to state that Russia choosing to try and blame Ukraine and the West will draw in more threats in the future by radicals emboldened by the plausible deniability that staging terror attacks could give them. Meanwhile, Russian citizens had to try and mourn their loved ones whilst all of this finger-pointing nonsense was going on. Turning a tragedy into an international political football isn't exactly endearing to those who were most affected by it. Overall, the Crocus City Hall event was a lot of things. It was an undoubtable travesty, a rotten waste of human life at the expense of dogmatic terrorists eager to further their radical cause. It was an avoidable avalanche of death. All the Kremlin had to do was put its pride aside and take Washington, D.C.'s threats seriously. The pitiful police and government reaction only further enshrines the attack's legacy as a failure on all fronts by the Russian government to protect its citizens. It's also an event that showcases just how politics can interfere with the country's grief. Rahm Emanuel once famously said that you should never let a serious crisis go to waste. But we can't help but feel that everyone would have been better off if Moscow had simply left it well enough alone. And to finish on a more enlightening note, Crocus City Hall is also about resilience. The Russian public mourned and grieved their fallen friends and families with a public vigil at the site of the attack. Many ordinary Russians came to show their support. Even the band Picnic got in on the act and played a show 4 days after the attack, showing them that the way to defeat terrorism isn't by brutal torture or by blaming others. It's defeated by people choosing not to be afraid, by standing up, carrying on, and boldly saying that they choose to not live in fear. Thank you for watching.